So I'm going to be talking today about the personalization of generative AI for co-creation in the visual arts. My name is Ahmed Abuzuraiq, and I'm a president work with Philippe Pasquier. We are both from the School of Interactive Arts and Technology in Canada. So let's start. So a few years back, the smooth look and feel of generative adversarial networks were the norm amongst AI artists. These models could be trained by artists on their own datasets or even their own model architectures. More recently, the foundational text-to-image models have overshadowed these personally trainable models, but they also made high-quality image generation accessible to everyone. But the same impressive potential that these large models have raises questions on how they would fit into or impact creative practices. In particular, how do they impact artists' sense of agency and ownership? In this climate, we argue that personalizing generative AI became more important than ever. But why is personalization important? We think it's because when artists have more means for personalization, they would have more creative control in the process. And by having more control, they can make more decisions. And by making more decisions, they would be closer to feeling a sense of ownership over their work. Secondly, by having more control, they have an increased ability to realize their visions, which contributes to a sense of agency. And lastly, by personalizing generative models, artists can push these models in directions of their own choosing instead of being bound by what the model can produce. Let's dig deeper. Before large-scale text-to-image models, artists could use personally trainable models for art creation, and they had multiple ways to do that by navigating, adapting, or crafting. So navigation happens when you are looking exploring in the generative space and sampling from it. For example, in the case of StyleGAN, or interpolating in the latent space or projection. Adapting is when we are fine-tuning the model and on a specific data set. But artists can also train their own model architectures and in their own data set, and they can manipulate trained models, for example, by blending models together. Similarly, on large-scale text-to-image models, artists can navigate the generative space through prompting, through language, and they can adapt these models to learn new styles or subjects or objects through adaptation models, like methods like Dream Booth and textual inversion. But the crafting of the kind available on personally trainable models is no longer accessible to most artists. In fact, a recent system was proposing that they can train on a fraction of the cost that is required for Stable Diffusion 1.5, but the cost is still $26,000. So this is inaccessible due to the computational demand of doing so. But whether artists navigate, adapt, or craft generative models, they are personalizing. We see them as different ways of creating personal work out of these systems. If we look at personalization as implemented on creativity support systems, we found that many systems allow users to generate images, but a smaller fraction only enable personalization through model adaptation or crafting. For example, in the table here, we see some systems that allow training or from scratch or fine-tuning existing models, both GAN-based and text-to-image systems alike. We observe also that these systems, that model crafting and adaptation is integrated into the system such that it's easy for users to switch between trained models or use these models in downstream image generation. Having argued for personalization and surveyed how personalization is implemented on creativity support tools, we make the case here that personalization should be integrated into how we think about co-creation as well. If we look at the interaction framework by Grabe et al., which covers different patterns of interactions within GAN systems, in particular, we propose that we can add a new interaction, which is personalizing. And in this pattern, users can choose models, choose datasets, train these models or fine-tune them, and then create from them, and then based on that, decide if they need to retrain or iterate on the training of the model. And by combining this new interaction pattern with the other patterns, we can better describe how prompt artists work. Prompt artists curate, they write prompts, they generate, and they save these results. They explore by editing the generated images, and they condition, for example, through outpainting or inpainting, and they personalize by fine-tuning on through techniques such as textual inversion. Now, I would like to go back to personalizing and its impact on creative control. Personalizing through model training, whether as part of adapting or crafting models, gives a higher creative control than personalizing through prompting or sampling alone. However, it requires more expertise and often has a high computational demand. But if we want to make personalization through model training accessible to artists on co-creative interfaces, we need to approach designing these interfaces differently, and we propose two mindsets for the design of these interfaces. The first is recognizes that for creative practices, a small data mindset might be more befitting at times. That relying on small but carefully curated data sets may be more meaningful for artists than working with large data sets that they have no control over. And sometimes the overfitting and bias, which is often associated with simple models, may actually be desirable in some cases if the artist wants the results to have a direct association and back from the dataset. Secondly, we can design interfaces with slowness in mind. A slow tech mindset calls for design for reflection and prolonged interaction. You can imagine it's like an object in your house that you interact with over time. There's no insistent need to interact with it all the time. For example, also a public art installation can slowly train and retrain models over time based on the public's interaction. So if we focus on personalization with small data mindset specifically, we can find multiple interaction opportunities for co-creation. First, co-creation can happen through changing the training dataset alone. And if that dataset is small, then it becomes easier to appreciate the impact that the data has on the results. Machine unlearning techniques are used to remove the effect of a training sample from a trained model. And when working with smaller models, that becomes easier to do. Some modified versions of simple models like variation autoencoders can be pre-trained so quickly that it becomes possible to quickly manipulate hyperparameters in real time. And this could be part of a co-creative interface. Lastly, often generative models learn a distribution from the training data, but others want to generate outside that distribution. Active diversion techniques do that. That's what they are meant for. And some of them, like network blending, are particularly easier to apply if the models are smaller. This is just in conclusion, personalization can improve artist agency and sense of ownership. It's increasingly common for personalization to be integrated into image generation tools, and extending co-creation frameworks with personalization can better describe AI artists' workflows. Finally, personalization through training has its challenges, but a small data and a slow technology mindset can provide effective lenses for designing around that, in addition to making it practical to support new interactions with generative models. That is all. We have another paper in the Generative AI and Ahmed workshop in Kai that's specifically about model crafting. You can check it out. We also have a new system, a no-code system for generative image generation. You can also take a look at. And yeah, thank you all.
Thank you for your presentation and for your patience. We have time for a few questions. Anyone? Michael, you want to ask a question?
Thank you. I'd love to. Ahmed, what a great project. I'm glad we began talking about it earlier. I was interested in the way that you extended Imke Grab's work to include personalization, and I was struck that what people were personalizing really was the prompt rather than the outcome, I think, which was not the way Imke was thinking and not the way we were thinking in an earlier piece that Imke was criticizing and correcting in her paper 2 years ago. So am I understanding correctly that the personalization is not of the outcome, but of the prompt as a means to get to the outcome?
I'm trying to actually expand how we think about personalization to include both the prompts and then and then the model that you generate from and adapting that model. So I'm talking more about, you could say, the source of the output, not changing the output itself.
Yeah.
I think referring to the paper, exploring is what refers to personalizing the output.
Yeah.
Is that you take the output and then you can change it and post-process it in a way. But personalization is more about going back to the source and whether it's a prompt or it's a model and changing that.
Very interesting extension. Thank you.